Welcome to the Poetry P podcast. This time I'm very happy to be joined by Shane Pruett, Poetry P's haibun editor, and Sean O'Connor, the founding editor of the Haibun Journal. Let's go and have a listen to what Shane and Sean have to say. But do listen to the end because I'll be letting you know what I found important and what might increase your chances of your submission being chosen by Poetry P. Now, if you've listened to Series 5, Episode 19, one where Sean O'Connor joins us to talk haibun, I'm guessing you've been looking forward to this bonus episode, the one where Shane Pruett and I get to ask Sean questions. As many of you know, Shane is the haibun editor here at Poetry P and a real enthusiast of the genre. So, Shane, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you back. And of course, Sean is here to take our questions. Hello, Sean.
Delighted to be back. Hello, Shane, and hello, Patricia.
So let me just remind you that Sean is the founding editor of the Haibun Journal, and there will be links, of course, to that journal and his website in the show notes. And you can find out lots about Sean on his website and buy his books too. The latest, Fragmentation, was a winner of the HSA Merit Book Award for Best Haibun Book, and he'll be reading some work from it on our Poetry P Readings podcast next year. So now I'm going to start off by inviting Shane to give you the first question, Sean. Over to you, Shane.
Thank you, Patricia. Really appreciate it. Sean, really great to have you here. One of the things that you spoke of that really stuck with me was the contextualization, that the sentences that we add were originally intended to contextualize or to place a frame around the haiku that are being presented. And you demonstrated that with often just on the death of a child, or, I mean, it was a very short piece of prose. Today, we write haibun that are much more expansive. And so I'm wondering, when you're looking at this as an editor or as a writer, how much prose? How do you kind of decide how much context, how much story to tell?
It's very difficult to answer that in general, because as a writer myself, I start off with haiku, but sometimes I might just write a few words between two haiku, and occasionally I might write a page and a half. It'd be 500 words. So I don't think there's any rule of thumb that I can give, except that if you're turning pages of prose and there's no haiku for quite a while, you might begin to wonder if you're still reading a haibun. And people have done that. You know, there are so-called haibun novels and all of that, and there's a haiku every once in a while. And, you know, if you lose your way along the road, if you begin to no longer recognize the journey as a haibun, then there's definitely gone too far. The principle I have, though, is that the haiku are primary and that they are driving the emotional narrative in particular. That's not to say there's no emotional narrative in the prose, there is, but that the real kick comes when you get to that haiku. So just in the same way, I would expand this slightly and say, there's this idea of what I call one-on-ones, which is prose followed by a haiku. We see this all the time. And I write a lot of these, and I'm happy with them. And people sometimes forget that the haiku might be first, and there might be no other haiku, be a haiku followed by prose. And it's a similar point. I mean, how is this structured is what you're really asking. So in that structure, sometimes we could write a sequence of haiku in a row in the middle of the prose. It could be prose followed by 8 haiku in a row, which we see a lot in Japan. And you see it a lot in Narrow Road to the Deep North in particular. There's often a dozen haiku in a row. So this notion of the structure is really what you're asking me. In the end, if the reader has forgotten that they're reading a haibun because there hasn't been a haiku for a long time, you could be pretty sure it's too far. On the other hand, there may be 8 haiku in a row, and people forget that possibility. Or it may be a long piece of prose that's 500 words for sake of kind of a page and a half on a journal, followed by a sequence. And again, I'm encouraging writers to think more broadly about the structure of the piece. To the basic point is the haiku drive everything, and the haiku are the point of the whole thing. And we lose sight of that. We're just writing prose and we're adding haiku in a, don't know what to say, slightly ad hoc way.
Mm-hmm.
I give a lot of haibun workshops, and the people who attend my workshops are always very surprised by this, to hear this. They say, I write prose and then I put a haiku and I might write some more prose. I said, that's great. And if you can do it, that's great. It's just, I've never done it. And I don't know any Japanese have ever done it like that. Maybe they have.
I just want to follow that up with a question we had from one of the community, or a point they made. Where does the haiku come in the sequence of things? And I think from what you're saying is that there is no rule. It can be at the beginning, it can be in the middle, it could be at the end. And like you said, there can be a whole sequence. Be a bit sort of free thinking in the way that you put it together, would you say?
I think the answer to this lies in the approach, because if you're approaching it, I'm going to tell a story and I'm going to tell it as a haibun. Mm-hmm. Then you know you're required to have prose and at least one haiku. You know that. Mm-hmm. So if you start off with, I know what the story is. It's about the old lady who murdered the bishop, and on a cold winter's morning. And so you start writing your prose. The old lady, it was a cold winter's morning and the bishop was coming along the street, and so on. And then you put in your haiku and then you're finished. Well, fair enough. But what I'm advocating is a different approach. You contemplate the story and start to write haiku about that, if you like. And now you've got your haiku, and there might be quite a few of them. So then you think, well, do one of these haiku act as a very good scene setter? Should I put one of those haiku first? Because actually I see one here now. And if I open up at that sets up the cold, frosty morning in the winter. And a sense of jeopardy. There's going to be a murder. So it can't have any old, the snow is falling outside and that's it. Oh no, we need jeopardy in here. And you happen to look at and that might naturally evolve when you're contemplating such a thing. So then you put your jeopardy in the beginning, and then you start to expand on that. The bishop was coming along, and the cold knife was flashing in the air and all that. You're writing your prose, and you think, here's a haiku now. And you're really always looking at your haiku. I've got my page of haiku handwritten beside me as I'm writing. I'm constantly looking over at them and thinking, am I heading towards one of these? And in the end, if I have, for sake of argument, 8 haiku, I may only use 2, or I may use all 8, and I may write some more, and I may rewrite them and I'll reorganize them. As the prose develops, there's this interaction going on. But you can see what I'm saying, that the haiku are the starting point of the whole thing and the focus of it. So I know exactly where I'm going haiku-wise all the time. So I don't think about the prose until I've got all that set up. It's a very different technique, and that's how it began.
One of our community, John, wanted to say that he was worried about his prose because he felt that was the weaker element of the haibun that he was writing. And from what you're saying, what I'm getting, and you may come back and tell me I'm wrong, but what I'm getting from that is perhaps John should really rethink the way he's doing it. Make sure his haiku are stars.
The haiku are the primary aspect of haibun writing. Otherwise, it's not haibun writing, it's flash fiction writing with some little poem at the end. Good news about prose writing is it's dead easy to beef it up and to learn how to write prose. There's a million workshops online about prose writing, and prose is prose. See, some people think, the prose in a haibun has to be poetic, or it has to be this, or it has to be that. I don't buy that at all. I think the style of prose is determined by whatever it is you're trying to express. So, I mean, if you think about it, writers like one of my favorite writers is John Steinbeck, and he doesn't write poetic prose, and nor does Hemingway, and Orwell. But my God, can they write? And they were pioneers of simplicity at the time. I mean, they were very conscious in what they were doing, and they wrote about the way they write and all. Well, Steinbeck less so. Steinbeck was a journalist actually as well, and so was Hemingway. Actually, now I think. And so was. Oh yeah, okay. I didn't realize that. But the point is that the prose needs work, and it's it's difficult to write good prose at the best of times, which is why I should say that I forgot to mention this earlier, but look at this. My opening editor's preface in the very first issue of the Haibun Journal says the following in paragraph 2: to compose worthwhile haiku can be surprisingly difficult. Adding to that task the writing of prose poetry in combination with haiku is a big ask. And that's why I think the haibun form is one of the most difficult forms to get into on the planet. I can't think of a more difficult way of writing. If you concentrated just on being an excellent prose writer, that's hard enough. And if you concentrate on trying to be a brilliant haiku poet, that's a big task. To be really good at it, to be recognized and be citable, and to be so citable, which is the target here, that members of the public will be able to cite your work off the top of their head in the same way as they do other poets. You know, everybody can, I wandered lonely as the cloud. And to write citable haiku that are award-winning and recognized and get the Nobel Prize, there's your task. And then to do the same with prose is very difficult. To do the two together in one form is, let's face it, a very tall order. So I don't think people should balk at the fact that it's difficult. We know it's difficult. So I'm trying to help you get out of the difficulty by saying you've got two tasks here, but your primary one is still the haiku. And getting that emotional resonance of the story so that it is literature and it's not journalism, if you know what I mean. There's your big task. And it's a great task, and when it works, it's superb. I mean, when you hear somebody read a haibun that's really laden with emotion and dread or whatever's going on, or beauty or whatever, and you're passionate about it, when you like the way some people speak about a lot of mainstream writers. I heard you speaking about Claire Keegan from Ireland earlier, and you were so animated. But we need people to read haibun and be animated by them, and we need them to hear a haibun read aloud and be engrossed and captivated. And that's the task of all writing. It's no more difficult than writing good short stories in a way, but it's got that edit dimension that you're trying to write poetry as well.
When we read for our journal, quite often Shane will write me a note and said, this one's just not engaging me. Isn't that right, Shane? We're looking to be engaged at the very start, whether it's haiku or prose.
Yeah, I want something that draws me in to the story. I want to feel, you know, Sean, you mentioned this earlier. I want some emotion. I want a connection to it. And the haiku really is the cornerstone of that. And then I think of the prose as just rounding out the story, taking me down maybe a different path than what I expected from the haiku, but coming back, kind of as a whole package. I look for that when we get our submissions.
That sort of brings me on to another thing that I'd like to clarify. You spoke in the workshop about Sean, the prose and the haiku having different rhythms. Is that also what we're looking for? We should see a change in rhythm between the two pieces.
Yeah, you see, a well-written haiku has a very clear rhythm. And therefore you can't, if it's well written, when it's read aloud, you cannot avoid the fact that something has happened here, because that is a different rhythm to prose. It's just that it is a break in the rhythm. More to the point, it's almost like we've arrived at rhythm now, because prose does not demand a strict rhythm. You can alter the rhythm. It's natural to alter the rhythm. Even the way I'm speaking now, I am altering my rhythm. Sometimes I might pause, and other times I might hesitate. Then I might speak really quickly because I get very animated all of a sudden. And that's how we write prose. But when I'm reading a poem, it's I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er hills and dales, and all at once I saw a crowd. And it's very, very clear that there's rhythm engages us. Now, I'm a former professional dancer, and I'm always a long time professional musician. And we drive everything with the rhythm. We depend on the rhythm to drive it. We get confused about that even slightly. If anybody starts going off signature with the rhythm, the whole thing falls down. But you can hear the clarity in music and dance, the clarity of rhythm. But in poetry, poetry is driven and defined by rhythm all the way. It always has been. It's that rhythm is mesmerizing in the story. And when you're hearing haiku or haibun read, you should know, even if you're listening on a radio and you can't see it on the page, you should know that there's a haiku now. I'll make a wisecrack about that. That's the haiku moment. You should hear it. And then if it switches again to prose, you should hear that now it's prose again. That clarity is what we're driving for. And it makes a big difference when you read it to a live audience, as I regularly do in Ireland. We're a very oral tradition in Ireland. We want to hear the work. You can, sense the audience getting up on the edge of their seat when the haiku comes in. And there's this, I read on radio recently, even over the radio, people were saying, those haiku. And how did they know? How did they know? People say, well, that's second haiku in that piece. Well, how did they know? Because I don't go, I'm now going to read a haiku bit. I'm just reading. I'm just telling the story. And it's like Isa. And then the scabs fell off and we began to feel encouraged. And then we started praying to the God. And but unfortunately, and it's all going on, it's just prose with this world of Jew. Is just a world of Jew. And yet, that's a haiku. Something has changed and you're drawn to it. And you can hear the sudden change in tone, rhythm, and it's emotionally laden. And it all starts to come together. And in that case, I don't think Isa could have written anything after it. That's now the end. That goes back to your question, Shane. That stopped the prose. That particular haiku in that case put an end to that. That wasn't going any further.
Absolutely, I agree that is that example. Really, the story's done. There's nothing else you can say.
That was actually very powerful. If people haven't heard you read it on the original workshop, they should go back and listen to that. That was very moving indeed. I want to talk about the haiku again. I'm sorry, but as you said, it's the primary driver here. I don't know whether we talked about it in great depth or you talked about it in great depth on the workshop, but the role of the kigo in the haiku, how do you feel about that?
Long before I went to Japan, back in the 90s, I was the editor of a print journal based in Ireland called Haiku Spirit. Okay. And I did eight issues from 1998 to 2000. It was founded by Jim Norton in 95. And we did 20 issues over 5 years. And that was in the year 2000. It was 2008 when I moved to Japan. So I had 8 more years of being very engrossed in haiku writing and all that. And I really did think there was very little I didn't know about haiku. Because I'd been already 20 years writing and I'd been the editor of this journal. And you know what I mean? I was full sure I knew. So then I arrive in Japan and I start studying Japanese. And I'm living in a village where no one speaks a word of English. And I start interacting with the haiku scene there. And out of nowhere, I start to notice everybody goes, well, of course there's kigo. Of course, you can't not have a kigo. No kigo's no haiku. And I go, now hang on a minute. Now we've been writing haiku for years, not really worrying about this kigo business. And they go, oh, well, they're not haiku. That's tanchi. They're just short poems. But the clarity with which the Japanese have is, no, a kigo is an essential requirement without which it's just not a haiku. It might be brilliant, and it could be stunning, and it could be the best 3-line haiku or the 2-line or 3-line or 1-line poem in the world, but it's just not a haiku. It's just non-negotiable. It's not an opinion. We don't discuss it. Nothing to say here, nothing to see. So I've gone, all right, okay, hang on a minute. I was been publishing all this stuff for years with no kigo, and I didn't care about that. As I was working with the Japanese over a long period of time, in Japanese in particular, I began to realize that this business of kigo is something really important here. And I listened to their struggles with it, and I listened to, if you're attending a lot of workshops all the time, I mean, it's prolific in Japan. 8 million active writers of haiku in Japan. And the penny dropped with me when, well, they told me, it's about the emotions. It's about the emotions. What is the emotional driver of this piece? What are you trying to direct the reader to feel? And that's where the kigo comes in. It's a tool for developing emotional resonance with the reader. So you know the way when people say, well, I don't like to be restricted in my work because if I don't want to use a kigo, I won't, or if I don't want to use 3 lines, I'll use 4, I'll use 2, I'll use 1, and all this. In the name of self-expression, this is said. This is what amuses me. And what I realized was that people who don't buy the idea of a form in the name of self-expression, and I'm going to make a big statement here, in general are not as very effective of expressing themselves. Because I read it and I'm going, what am I supposed to conclude here? What am I supposed to feel when I read it? It's clever, it's good, it's interesting, but I'm there going, where's the poetry in this? Whereas when you deliberately sit down in a room doing a workshop on haiku and they're all saying, yeah, but what emotion are you directing the reader to feel? Now notice the language. You're directing the reader. You are deciding that this is going to be painful. You're deciding that this is about loss. You're going to make them laugh or you're going to make them cry, but you're going to make them do something, or that's your attempt. So the intentionality of the emotional quality in haiku is very clear when you listen to the Japanese try and construct their kigo. They are openly saying, no, it's not sad enough. It's sad. Well, that's an interesting kigo. It's sad, but no, this is about the death of the child. We need to crank it up here. Or no, it's really about the gorgeousness of this situation that we're talking about. So it's actually slightly too sad. I need this to be uplifting. How are we going to make it uplifting? And we think of what kigo are we choosing in that sense. So this is really self-expression in the sense that the writer is owning what's going to happen here. The irony is writers don't express themselves. They express the world. Because if you put too much of your actual self into your writing, the reader gets switched off.
Yeah.
The reader doesn't identify with that. The reader doesn't care about the writer. Sorry to say it, I'm a writer. I don't think for 1 second that any reader in the world reading my work is going to wonder about what kind of life I'm having or whether I'm doing okay. Nobody ever writes up and say, I was just wondering, how are you getting on since your father died, since you wrote all that stuff about it? No, nobody does. Why would they? Because it's not about me. It's not about my father. It's about fathers, parents. It's about loss of people. It's about where we are in the world. I have no doubt about that. So I just give you one last example of this. I'm sorry for going. This is kigo you're asking me, but I want to just say this. When I was a teenager, I was mad about Dostoevsky. I read everything that this Russian novelist wrote, and I was passionate about Dostoevsky. Now, that's a long time ago. So now let me tell you the sum total of my knowledge about Dostoevsky. He wrote books that I read. I know the names of the books. I've read them. He was Russian. I think he had a beard. I think he lived in the 1800s, but I'm not entirely sure. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I know about Dostoevsky. And do I care? No. Well, I think he's dead as well. So, like, you know, some people do go in and they're fascinated by their writer, but the writer is not important. But the kigo are important because they allow the writer to find these nuggets, this device that injects an emotional resonance very deliberately. So if you want the jeopardy, you're going to have the ice about to break. If you go back to the story about the woman is going to kill the bishop and it's a cold winter's night, you're not going to put fresh snow on the ground there. There's no jeopardy in fresh snow. Fresh snow is a kind of gorgeous situation. No, you need ice about to crack.
Mm-hmm.
You need something that's going to hurt. There's a murder about to take place. So you're setting the tone. And that's what I think people forget, the role of kigo. The beautiful thing about it is you can take any time of the year, any moment, even when you're indoors. And if you tune into the world of what's happening around you in nature, you can create any emotional resonance from any situation. And don't take my word for it. Read prose writers who do it, like Hiromi Kawakami, who wrote this incredible book in English. It's Japanese, but she's not a haiku writer, as far as I know. But she wrote a book called Strange Weather in Tokyo. She has this novel about 2 people, a man and a woman, who live in the biggest metropolis in the world, Tokyo, 34 million people, and they're right bang in the middle of it. The whole story, they make a couple of trips outside town into nature briefly, but almost the entire story is just two individuals, and they're either in apartments in a big built-up city or they're in bars. And yet, all the emotional narrative is driven by her references as a writer to the change in season. There's a sudden chill in the air. All those clues, even when they're in the bar, the food they're having, it's the time of year when we can get this type of fish. The whole point of it is the two characters don't connect very well directly emotionally. So nothing is said by the characters that give you a clue about what they're feeling. When you get to the end of that book, I guarantee you, I defy you to read the end of that book and not cry. That's Kigo. It's Kigo. She generates it all by Kigo. When you get to the end, you are just saturated with emotion, and you think, where did this emotion come from? And Claire Keegan does it too.
Oh yeah.
She does it in abundance.
I'll put these books in the show notes. But I think, Shane, did you have a follow-up question for Sean on that one?
I did. Actually, as we're talking about Kigo, how do you feel about, in the context of a single haibun, shifting seasons? And I mean, number one, is that something that is a useful device? And number two, does the shift only need to occur in the haiku as a traditional kigo, or as you're kind of suggesting here, can that be really the interplay between the prose and the haiku?
I never fully understand what people mean by the interplay between prose and haiku. People mean different things by that. Mm-hmm. And I never talk about that. Right? You'll notice I've never said the interplay between the prose and the haiku, because the haibun is a complete thing. It's almost like using different techniques in the prose writing as you go. The haiku is another aspect of the form we're using. So I don't see that clean separation between the two. And I'm not that convinced about conversations between the relationship between the two as if they're somehow separate, because it's one unit that we're talking about. So change of seasons. Now, this is a very interesting question. I enjoy this. This is a great challenge in haibun when you know you want to change the season, when you've got a haiku that's in spring and the next one's in autumn. So you just take account of that, because you don't need to, from an emotional point of view, you can stay in any season or any even day of the year and keep generating different emotional resonances. As I said, the snow outside the window can be done as a beautiful thing, uplifting, or it can be done as a very sorrowful thing because someone who's died, that kind of thing. But in cases, because I had this in a workshop this week, somebody said, oh yes, but if I've just got these spring ones and then all of a sudden I have an autumn one. I said, well, that's very simple. You just put in a line between those two. It's all about skill, and it's all about figuring out these problems and these challenges in the writing. It can be done. You can overcome these things if you give it a little bit of thought and guide the reader. Don't shock the reader by suddenly jolting the brakes on and turning the seasons. Don't have it snow in the middle of summer. You know, it's not going to work. And the readers pick up all of these details. So you can say, though, which reminds me of last winter. I mean, I'm being blunt, but a little bit unskilled there. Mm-hmm. But you can go back and forth, because stories do go back and forth. The stories change. The haibun form is not stuck on a particular day, but it's helpful if it stays in the day, but it's not stuck there. And one last thing I'll mention that always strikes me about a comment that a very leading Japanese haiku expert, I suppose you could call him, said, which struck me very much. He said, Westerners always talk about haiku as being something in the moment, which is true. And he says, but for us Japanese, and by the way, for us Irish too, the past is in the present. That's a very common statement we have in Ireland. We're still living in the famine. We still remember the famine, and it was 100 years before I was born. Mm-hmm. But we have historical memory. Yeah. And our past is in our present all the time. And the Japanese are very strong on that idea. In any moment of life, the whole of the past exists. So you don't look at a field of beautiful barley without someone having planted it in the first place. So we already have an allusion to the past. And, straight away in everything we look at, even when we look at the stars, we're looking in the past anyway. In Zen, we're in the moment, but the moment is not a moment, because we're in the future and the past together. And eventually we can get a sense that there is no time. So the true moments are beyond time. And even at a simpler level, every moment, the present is always got the past contained in it. We would not be talking today if in the past Patricia didn't contact me. Simple as.
How do you deal with people, the do's and don'ts about writing about people in a haibun?
Do you mean like relatives, friends, close people, real people? Is that the
I think,
sort of thing?
real. Let's look at sort of, I suppose it's the question about how do you deal with when you're writing about something that's very close to you as well.
People do it, and they seem to get away with it. And I don't know how. Now, I do notice in the end that they say, like, I remember one reading about some very horrendous stuff about the circumstances of their father, but they did say, my father read this book. And these are ethical questions, but I'll tell you what I do.
Mm-hmm.
I go back to the point I made earlier. No one cares about the writer. I don't want to necessarily know about your actual wife, husband, partner, friend, brother, sister, your actual one. I'm sorry, but get your ego out of it. It's not about you. It's about the world. So try and provide us with something that we can relate to. Let's say you're talking about father and you've never had a father. You were born with no, you didn't know who your father was. Lots of people have that. And so people that never had a father can still read it with aplomb. I've never had a child, but I'm very moved by Isa's account of the death of his 7-year-old girl. He's not going on about his own stuff there. He's talking about the reality of what he went through. Mm-hmm. And you notice he's cared about how he talks about his wife's reaction and them together. And the pain of the reality of that situation comes across beautifully because it's unegotistical. And I think egotistical writers like to tell us all about what they had for their breakfast and the bloodstains in the bathroom. And just personally, I think avoid all of that and stick to the general thing. Now, I have a joke going at the moment that I have clearly written fragmentation about my experiences with my father. But here's the twist. The twist is I would get, if the CIA themselves put all their resources into trying to find out, based on what they read in the book, who my father is, they'll be hard pushed. Because every detail about my father has been changed. And I dedicated the book to him, and I said, dedicated to my dad. So you don't know his name. Mm. The mountains outside the window were changed for similar mountains in another area. My family who know him, obviously, his own family were laughing at me saying, what do you mean putting that river there? Said, that river's 100 miles away. Said, yeah, but it's a similar river, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So where he lives exactly, what he exactly did. And then what I did on top of that was I took stories of other people I'd worked with dementia and integrated them and referred to them as my father.
Yeah.
So at no point can you get my actual father. But what's really strange is when I read the review in, I think it was Frog Ponder, somebody recently wrote a little review about when it won the award. I was very struck when the writer said the words that you can sense the writer's comradeship or camaraderie with their father. Mm-hmm. I was really moved by that because I didn't realize it. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize the camaraderie that we had until a long time after the book was published. And I read this last week and I was quite startled by this. So this brings us to another question. Ironically, when we approach it without, dare I say unegotistically, but not wanting to tell our actual story, but tell the story. Mm. There's a difference.
Yeah.
John Updike once said that being a writer is like being stopped in customs and they open your bag and you look in and you go, I don't remember putting that in there. And you do surreptitiously include things that you're not even aware of. So I was not aware that I had a great comradeship with my father until a year after the book is published. And someone in America that I don't know, I don't think I thought about anyway, said it. And then I
Yeah.
looked and I went, oh yeah. So in other words, not only is it not about the writer, but the writer themselves has a lot to learn from their own writing.
Mm.
We write things without realizing it. The story takes over, and the characters, whoever they are, they tell you what they will and won't do. And they refuse to take part in activities they're not comfortable with. I see this as a writer all the time. So in terms of people, I would tread really carefully about anything that identifies. So for example, if I write about my sister in great detail, I've got a shock for you. I've never had a sister. But if I did have a sister and I actually wrote about my actual sister and said that's my sister and wrote the truth about my sister, that would be, I find that unnecessary.
Yeah.
But you can talk about having a sibling who's female, and you can talk about having a sibling who's male, but you should always never forget, it's not about your actual story. It's about the underlying story that the whole world relates to, or that everybody can relate to, regardless of whether they've fished in Alaska or not. But they can get fishing in Alaska. It's not about your fishing in Alaska. I don't know if it's a very complicated way of giving an answer to that, but I hope it helps.
This has been a brilliant discussion. I've learned a lot in a short amount of time, and I really appreciate your answers and your thoughts on all of this, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. It's been a pleasure again talking to you and getting our questions answered. And I'll just leave the final words up to you. Sean.
Well, I've got to say that I've really enjoyed this because you guys are just got so much energy for this subject. And I can tell as well in working with you both in both of these occasions that you have a real energy for writing in general and literature and art. And there's no better way to spend some time than with some people who share a passion. And I'm really pleased that we connected and we came here. And I'm very grateful to anybody watching or listening to this who shares that passion as well. We have to have great gratitude for that sharing of passion, and it is about a passion. So enjoy every minute of the reading haiku and writing them, and think positively about it. This is about enjoyment. Tanoshi, the Japanese say. It's fun and it's challenging and it's great and it's exhilarating, and the outcome can be marvelous. So let's focus on all of that, not just the difficulties of it. It's great. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, now, wasn't that a treat? I hope you thought so too. Sean and Shane will certainly be back. Sean, I know, is going to do a reading from his book Fragmentation, and I really hope I can persuade him to read a smidgen from his newest work, The God of Bones. It's another must-read if you want to push yourself to write better haibun. So what did I bring away from this? Well, there was an awful lot, but things that really stuck with me would be grab our attention from the get-go, whether you choose to start your piece of work with a haiku or with prose. And if you haven't tried writing the haiku first, give it a go. See how that works. Let us know, which do you prefer, writing your prose or writing the haiku first? And something that's really stuck with me is the idea of putting too much of myself in the piece. As Sean said, it's not about you or me. It's about the underlying story that the world can relate to. And perhaps what I'd also say what struck me is the importance of kigo to your work. But actually, if you've been listening to me at all, you know how important I think kigo is for all the reasons that Sean said. So those are the things I thought were important. If I've missed something, email me, let me know. It's always good to know what you're thinking. And just as an aside, I'm actually reading Strange Weather in Tokyo at the moment. Haven't got to the end, so I don't know if I'm going to be in tears yet. But I am enjoying it, and I'm definitely connecting with the characters. And the book I read by Claire Keegan was Small Things Like These, which, as Sean said, I'm absolutely passionate about. I loved it so much. Sean also worked on a film of her book. The book was called Foster, and I think the film's called The Quiet Girl, but details will be in the show notes. And I believe Sean got a credit on the film. My. We are working with celebrities these days, aren't we? So thank you for joining us today. It's really wonderful to have your company and not to be just talking into the void. As Sean said, this is about enjoyment. So until we meet again, keep writing. Ciao.